Mike, just let me know.
Yeah, just go up the top and click display settings and switch display, and that should be totally fine. Yep, that's the top one, sorry.
Are we good there?
Almost. Go back, sorry. There we go. That's perfect. So I'm going to let you take it off from here, but thank you very much, and good luck with the presentation.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks for seeing you guys again. I can't believe it's been a year. So unlike the presenters that you have on and the theme of your presentations around being anti-drone and counter-drone, we, of course, here in South Africa and our company called Drone Guards, work with drones for good, and we use drones to secure our people and high-value assets. And specifically today, what I wanted to talk about is how we are effectively integrating drone technology into existing operations to fight crime. We have a very high crime rate in South Africa, and we're specifically integrating this into law enforcement as well as private security. So just very, very briefly about me, I'm the director of our company called Aerial Works, which is a CAA registered drone operator, and our security arm, Drone Guards. I'm a safety and security post holder for our company. I sit on the board of COASA, and I also chair the new applications chamber for our Drone Council in South Africa, which was formed last year. And I've been fortunate enough to co-author a couple of books called Drone Professional 1 and 2. As you can see on this photo on the top left, we're doing quite a lot of work with the South African Police Service here. And so oftentimes when I am on site doing some safety work and some risk assessment work on sites, I get the pleasure to hang out with our local police. Very briefly, for those that weren't in the session last year, our drone operations in South Africa are regulated by the South African Civil Aviation Authority. And as much as people quibble about our very strict regulations here, it is actually what is translated down through ICAO and our Acts of Parliament into what we have to operate against in South Africa. Again, very briefly, anytime we operate commercially in South Africa using a drone, we have to have licensed personnel, we have to be licensed as a company, and we have to have our aircraft registered as well as insured for third-party liability. For context, we, at this point in time, I still think probably globally, but specifically in South Africa, we, in the context of security, are able to operate one drone and buy one pilot. Of course, our current security solutions in a very simplified manner are very much, a guard with a torch. And the future for us most certainly holds potentially sitting in a control room somewhere in another city, even controlling multiple drones. We're hoping in the near future to be able to have one pilot, many drones, particularly in the context of potentially swarming. But right now we need one pilot, one drone, and that pilot needs to be on site and have control of that drone, even if we're managing automated missions. So what does law enforcement look like in South Africa? And that is something that we're very interested in. We have our local, what we call metro police, and they're normally the traffic police. We have a private investigation arm called the Hawks, and we also have our police service. And of course, we have our private security. Now, why are we talking, law enforcement integration or drones integration into law enforcement in South Africa? Well, our crime rate in South Africa is massive. We do still take up 4 of the top 10 spots in the most dangerous cities in the world from a crime and murder rate perspective. Our unemployment teeters around 30%. And this slide here is quite basic, but it tells a massive story. And this is really around the fact that our police service in South Africa is woefully under-resourced. Total employees in the police service sits at about 180,000. In contrast to about 2.5 million registered private security officers in South Africa, of which we think 5.5 million are employed. And we have about 10,000 registered private security businesses in South Africa, or security companies. I think the global best practice stats for police per citizen is about 220, and we are about 1 police officer to 310 police officers, and to 310 citizens. And it's a massive problem with as much crime as there is. The private security industry in South Africa is regulated by something called the Private Security Industry Regulator. And of course, you can see that private security outnumbers our police force. So I want to give you 2 use cases today of where we are using drones for good to curb crime. One is a practical example of securing a CBD. Johannesburg CBD is rife with crime, active hit, as well as just random murders in the middle of the street during daylight, robberies, crime syndicates, etc. And so basically, this started a couple of years ago with the closure of a major highway that connects kind of areas coming into the CBD. And this is just a collection of news articles during that time where this major motorway had to be closed because of major renovations. It was actually starting to show some stress damage, etc. And so they had to close this motorway. And with the result that people who actually worked in the city, and there are major banks and huge corporations that have decided to stay in the city, they own those buildings, despite the high crime, needed to look after their employees because their employees were being hijacked and robbed while they were sitting in these major traffic jams. So basically the private sector got together and said they need to do something about this crime. There wasn't enough of a police force to actually ensure that they could help the motorists and the pedestrians coming into town. And so basically, we were called in at the same time as a Forum for Integrated Risk Mitigation Group was formed, short is firm. And this was basically the private sector coming together, all the individual companies, banks, etc. And they said, right, how can we help create safe corridors for our employees? And part of that solution was, as you can see up the top right-hand side, every company that had their own security guards actually trained them in the same way. They wear body cams, they wear they have two-way radios. At a later stage, they went onto the Zello platform because they actually, the cops, the police didn't have enough budget for radios to be able to communicate with the private police force. And they all wear the same high-vis jackets. And then, of course, the drone security would have been integrated into that. And so the whole idea was to have zones that would create a kind of a permanent aerial view of that whole city area. The whole idea, and I won't go through everything, but the whole idea is that proactive operations in conjunction with the ground forces would have then created safe corridors, as I already said. That drone footage streamed into control rooms. The visible policing, also from an aerial perspective, also monitored security teams, and that's what they wanted. real-time monitoring of randomized missions. And then, of course, there are ground security measures, but this was a layer on top of that. There are hotspots that, are focused on, and this is all about preventing and preempting. Of course, from an incident response perspective, you can see things unfolding in front of you, and we actually did some work for a major implosion that happened of a major building that they were going to demolish. And so you can literally see it's an eye in the sky, which is a view that the security forces on the ground never had before. The idea is really not to interfere if you don't have to, and so the cease and desist approach was really the chosen method, where speakers can be used to communicate with pre-recorded messages, etc. In the city centre, where of course, specifically with financial services organizations, there's always that threat of terrorist activity. That mass evacuation could actually be aided with drones, where safe corridors again can be marked, and real-time monitoring of those emergency situations, and then tracking and monitoring of vehicles, suspects, etc. Post-incident activity with this drone technology is really around footage that's permissible in court. It's geotagged, it's time-stamped, it's stored as appropriate. We actually have a new Privacy and Data Protection Act that's been in for a while, but it's now active from May. And so storing of this data is very important. And then, of course, for training, to understand what the MO of the syndicates is, etc. And then we've started this, but really around machine learning. So, pattern identification, and we really want to be removing the human intervention over, over incident response, etc. So this is kind of what the city centre, part of the city centre, looks like. This is one of the operations that we were involved in to actually secure a perimeter there. And this is where we've already for over 2 years been working with the local public safety agencies and law enforcement. And this was that one event that we assisted with. So evacuation and security surveillance, that I'm not going to play this video in the interest of time, but this is kind of the eye in the sky view that the security teams never had before. And so, with tall buildings and narrow streets, and a lot of them in the city centre being one ways, pursuing someone or seeing something but not being able to get there is always a pretty big challenge. So fast forward through COVID, because that project was actually put on hold because of funding and COVID lockdown and what have you. These images are actually from a simulation exercise we did a few weeks ago, again with the SAPs. This guy on the top left-hand side is Colonel Govender, who is in charge of one of the police precincts, and our client. And basically, the idea there was to kickstart the approval process of being active in that firm security operation, specifically around tracking vehicles that have been picked up on their license plate recognition software and their cameras that are in place. So I'm just going to play this. There's no sound to this, but just as an example of essentially what it is that we're going to be doing in the city centre. So just a really benign flight. And what we wanted to do here is demonstrate to the client, and specifically the cops, the police teams, of the zoom capability of the actual drone that we use to demonstrate this. And the maneuverability. This specific exercise was done with a multi-rotor, and the reason for that is because you can see how it's flying between these buildings. It's the latest technology, so it has very little interference from the buildings, etc. And this specific footage is being streamed into one of the control rooms, which is kind of underground in the building that we were operating of. So the idea here, and you'll see it in a second, is that it can keep an overview of vehicles approaching a traffic light system, and this is often where the hijackings take place, when stationary vehicles are exposed to someone who's hiding, and concealed, and then comes out with the firearm or what have you. In a second, it will switch over to the actual simulation exercise where there was a vehicle that was pointed out that we now needed to pursue, which is coming up now. And the technology, I mean, it's not amazing technology that none of you are aware of, but you'll see now the actual camera is acquiring this target, and it's the second vehicle from the right, which has now been identified as the target to pursue. And you will see in a second, it's actually locking onto that target. And the challenge that the police and the security forces have in the city center at this very spot is that as soon as this number plate recognition system picks up a number plate of a vehicle that's been involved in a crime previously, or is kind of under a wanted mark, they lose it behind buildings. And you can see here, this camera continues to focus on it as it's disappearing behind the building. And here there are two ways for the vehicle to disappear. One is left away and one is right underneath this bridge and then onto the motorway. And by the time the police or the security forces can actually get to that spot, they've lost them. And so the idea is with the drone, they can then already know where they're needing to deploy their resources to. This was just a picture or two pictures of the footage being streamed live into the control room, and you can see there on the left picture on the top right hand side, that's actually the first person view from the and with the controller overlay, which is really locking onto that vehicle. And so, we didn't fly over the highway because we didn't have permission on that day to do that through the roads agency. But the idea is, once the permissions are in place, to be able to do that. So it's really giving information through to the individuals on the ground that need to be pursuing. I presented this recently somewhere, and people were just blown away. This is a very basic tool, and I don't know whether you're all familiar with that, but Zello is an app. It mimics a walkie-talkie or two-way radio. And as you can see on the left-hand side here, the Joburg Central Police Station is actually using this. And there are like 25 people on there, including police officers, including we are on there when we're there doing drone ops. We are called Eagle One now. And there are also citizens on there who are literally, feeding information. And it just by using this has cut costs, and it's also just increased efficiency of communication, where for information sharing, heads up by citizens, they've actually cut the crime in that specific area for that precinct by 50%. Now, it's still very high, but just by doing these few things, by increasing communication, etc., it's already helped. Now, the challenge we have in South Africa, even if like this was an operation we did recently from a rooftop where there's zero risk to anybody while you're operating, you're of course going to be flying over people, property, and public roads. And so this is a very basic kind of depiction of the permissions that we need to obtain in order to fly in an area like the city of Joburg. So first of all, police service has to know that we're flying there and has to give permission. The properties we're flying over in this very instance are privately owned, or at least owned by the organization. So ABSA Bank, Anglo-American, First National Bank, etc. And then, of course, the public roads. So Joburg Road Agency, as well as the police. And of course, in South Africa, you know, the accountability that people are willing to take to give these permissions is quite slim. And so, you know, for the permanent operations to actually kick into place, there is still quite a lot of work to do to be able to do that. And it's all from a risk perspective because we're flying over people, property, and public roads. And so we continue to work with the Cooperative Governance Council. We continue to work with the police and the firm to get this implemented into a permanent solution. And really, it's around getting, you know, getting those public agencies and the law enforcement agencies on board. But it's been massively successful, and the people on the ground just can't wait for this to actually kick into place on a permanent basis. Okay, and so this is, and Mike, I'm sure you'll stop me when my time is up, but I'm going to plow through this. This is the second use case, and this is again where we have integrated drone technology into a private nature reserve where they have in-house security. The community around these properties that are massive and very kind of far apart and at quite high risk, although not as high risk as in the Joburg city center, they have almost no support from the local police force because of a lack of resources. They just don't have the vehicles, they don't have the manpower to actually help out in these situations when crime happens. The crime profile of this kind of scenario is a little bit lower. It's really petty crime, but it's a private nature reserve that has about 1,200 beds in high value and kind of 5-star private lodges. And their reviews started going down because their crime rate started getting quite high. So this is where visible policing, I'm not going to play this whole video, but essentially, again, we started here and we still have a permanent drone team on site. We started doing what we called gate awareness operations. So where the contractors come in during the day to work on site, they're cleaners, they're maintenance people, you know, this is where they think the inside jobs and information gets leaked to people. And this was actually literally on the first gate operation. This vehicle that's standing, that you can see coming up now that the drone is focusing on, didn't actually pull up to the gates, which is the normal process. And they kind of stood outside. So the normal process is that the vehicle would drive up, the individuals climb out, they go through, at this point in time, their COVID-19 tests, or at least their protocols to sign in and get their temperature and checked and what have you. And then the vehicle checks in. But these guys literally, and by the way, you know, nothing happened here, nothing untoward happened, but the security guards at the gate called this out as suspicious. And so they had actually noticed the drone and were looking up at it. But they gave this vehicle eventually a thorough kind of search because they kind of thought that they were bringing something in, or at least maybe the driver was. So this very, very quickly spread as a kind of message throughout this nature reserves, contractors and what have you, that there are eyes in the sky. So let's not even mess. And literally they used to have crime every weekend. And from the implementation, within like the first 9 weeks, there were a couple of incidents where we found people on site but it cut the crime right down because of the presence of the drone. This is where we're actually training local security staff on how to work with the drone team, because it's about identifying something, and when the drone team identifies something, to through radio communication vector these individuals in on a very dark, desolate site. We also did some kind of covert operations where the drone team parked elsewhere and then flew over areas where they were building new lodges, etc. And this is again training the local team. These were some simulation exercises. And it just goes to show that, you can see from these faces, even the first night when the thermal camera was demonstrated to them, and I'm just going to play kind of a minute of this, but this is so dark that those security teams, have their tiny little torches, but you cannot see your hand in front of your face. And all of a sudden, with the thermal camera and the specs that we have on that thermal camera, they could literally see individuals walking. And it just proved, kind of eye-opening, and it's just a completely new world for them. And this is now the kind of result of us engaging. You can see on the bottom left, the local police, kind of heads. There's a brigadier sitting with the white shirt kind of at the bottom of the screen. And this is really a town hall with community protection forum individuals, the actual GM of the nature reserve, all the neighbors. So we've engaged the neighbors as well to get their permission for us to fly over their land if there is a pursuit in play, etc. And so really engaging the community as well as engaging the police force, where they know that, it's an additional layer and it's helping them because they really don't have the resources, as I already said a number of times. So the outcomes here are, the neighboring communities have been engaged. We've reduced the crime. It's a permanent drone program, so they fly every weekend when the hotspots, or at least when the witching hours are. And we've been invited a number of times now to work with the local police to actually help them when they do their visible policing on the main roads, etc. We're also implementing a neighbor model where the neighboring farms and sites are actually working together now with a shared drone, because the cost is still quite high in South Africa. So basically, what are we doing in South Africa with drone technology from a drones for good perspective? And it's really around staying ahead of the criminal. The criminals don't care about our regulations. The criminals don't care about safety. The time delay of sometimes getting to places from a permission perspective. There are still technology limitations from a cost perspective, from a human perspective, and also, the stakeholders that need to be engaged are oftentimes expecting, the drones to be armed, expecting the drones to be able to, display a, 24-hour hang time for very little cost and no regulation. So, we do still have limitations, and oftentimes in a engagement of local law enforcement agency and security perspective, there's the question of who pays for this, because the whole reason for us integrating from a private sector perspective with law enforcement is because law enforcement in South Africa just isn't resourced and doesn't have the money. So it ends up being private sector paying for this. But if we can together address the crime in our country, then of course, we do that with pleasure. And then of course, we talk about having an integrated workforce, and it's the most effective way of, and we say fight crime, but it's really, and we've seen examples of this, it's really around moving crime, because it's not eradicating crime. It's really around potentially moving crime to a less heated area, and they go to the next soft target. However, having that air force is really empowering those local security and law enforcement agencies. And Mike, that is my story. I'm very happy to answer questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Kim, or should I call you Eager One, I guess. You're a terrific storyteller, and it's really interesting because, as you said, drone security is not just about securing them or countering them, but using them for these security purposes.
Yes.
And so I really appreciate you sharing those kind of on-the-field vision and photographs of your operations.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Are there any questions?
There are. So I was going to go through these now. So the one question was in the chase locking scene, if the BVLOS was dynamic and goes into different areas you were not originally allowed to go into, how do you get that dynamic or live BVLOS permission?
Yeah, you don't. You don't. Yeah. So look, you can't. It would be illegal then. So, and that is the problem we still have in this country, because essentially the client expectation is that you're going to pursue that vehicle or that individual until capture, right? And if, unfortunately, the ground forces cannot reach that, that target by the time we've reached another motorway or, another built-up area where those permissions run out, we can't continue. So the caveat to that is, if the police force who work under different regulations, so if they own the drone, and they operate the drone in permanent operations, they override the CAA in that aspect.
Oh, wow.
But so they can go anywhere, right? So, even with their helicopters, right, we've been operating, and it wasn't a security operation. We were operating, doing a land survey. And this helicopter basically came straight into our area of operation. And, the PIC got on the radio and before we'd recognized it was a SAPS helicopter, the PIC kind of said, drone operation, get out the way. And expletive, basically, because it was a SAPS helicopter. And they operate, and they can operate at any, obviously safe, but at any altitude. So they can operate wherever they need to, if it was their drone and if they were operating it. But since we're operating it, even though it's under SAP's permission, we would still have to operate within the boundaries of where our permissions are. And that is the challenge we have in South Africa still with, it all comes down to safety, right? So now we might be operating in a uncontrolled airspace. And now we're pursuing, and now we're heading into controlled airspace, and we don't have that permission. Unless we know that, if we were to really be forward thinking and actually get permanent permissions for, kilometers and kilometers around that. So of course there's a solution for that, but practically you never know where these targets are going to head to, right?
Yeah, wow. Okay. And in that same vision, you mentioned Sabsa Bank and some of the banks there. If they don't own the airspace above their property or their buildings, why do you have to get permission for them?
Because we are flying over it. So it's all about landowner permission, and it's all about privacy and so it isn't their airspace, but the airspace over them would not override, but be in addition. So the permissions we would need, that's Special Rules West, just as an example. So we would broadcast by that frequency. If that was controlled airspace, we would have permission to fly there anyway, via a KMU reference. But any property you fly over, road or property, whether it's privately owned or government owned, that's the permission you would have to get.
Yeah, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And another question we had on that same, I guess, film section was which drone make and model and potential fit outs were you using for that video you showed? I assume it's probably the first one with the zoom in.
Yeah, so that specific one is a DJI M300 with an H20T camera. Pretty standard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Very nice piece of kit for that.
Out of interest, Kim, how large is your fleet? I guess if you've got some of these semi or permanent installations in different places, and is it ever purchased or owned by the client, or is it always yours and it's your fleet that is being kind of rented out as that service?
Yeah. So the size of our fleet is confidential, but the combination of whether the client owns the asset or whether we deliver the service, we have both. So it's probably coming up to an equal spread of both. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's more cost effective for the client to own the asset. So we kind of have a model where that works quite well, as opposed to the client, bringing us in for a full service.
Okay, brilliant. And I've got another one here which says, do you see any drone in a box security guards replacing any of the semi-manual operations that you currently do?
Yes, of course, that's the future, right? The reason why our technology now is still so, or at least the service is still so expensive, because it needs that human intervention 100% of the time. Even though we can do automated missions, you still need to be on site to be able to take control if something goes wrong. So drone in a box is an interesting one, because I probably have 4 or 5 calls on that in a week, where people are just saying, I just want that drone in a box thing, or that drone on the roof thing, or that, whatever. So that would be fully automated and, fully autonomous. And that is not regulated in South Africa yet. So I see there are a couple of security companies that are kind of quoting their clients on these things, or saying they're going to quote, and then they try and find the actual solution, and they can't yet. So I know it exists. There are military applications that are trying this already, or testing it already, but I have not seen it in South Africa. But it has to be the future, right? It has to be where something is just permanently charged by, solar. We've got sunshine pretty much all round the year, same as you guys, I guess, Mike, depending on where you are. But it's there's still a lot of considerations, how integrated that technology is with your fence triggers and your ground control and, your machine learning, because clearly a drone is only going to be as useful as what the resulting action is going to be from what it sees, right? So, but in short, the answer is yes, I do see it, but it's not here yet from a regulation and actual, accessible technology yet.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. And there's something here that mentions on your permanent aerial view of the city, were any of these tethered or based on, again, drone in a boxes? And the second question is, were any of them threatened by those you were surveilling or noticed?
Okay, good question. So no, we've never used a tethered drone system. I kind of have personally, and in our company, we've never seen the use for it, because the cost of it and the flexibility of it just doesn't make sense. So number one, none of what you saw was from a tethered drone. Yeah, so I think maybe the question is around that one image from the top. That's just an image we took from the actual drone. And what was the second part of the question? Oh, whether our drones were threatened. Is that the question, Mike?
Yeah. Were any of your drones ever threatened or noticed by those you were surveilling?
Yeah, so we have not had any threats to our drones yet.
Nice.
But we do know of stories, and it was not our teams, it was actually another company who had actually resulted, their surveillance, their drone surveillance resulted in an arrest of an individual. And when they kind of, unpacked his backpack to see what he was carrying in it, there was this like a homemade slingshot. And you guys are all going to be laughing at this, but they asked him, what's the slingshot for? And he's like, for the drone. So, it's very rudimentary. I have also heard of a drone being shot at, and these are like where your high risk areas like mines that are being protected, where the value of what's being protected is very high, and so the criminals will do whatever they need to do to get in. I mean, the security guards on the ground get shot at, and the guys have hand grenades and stuff. But I've never heard of a drone actually being ruined, like as in taken out physically by a ground threat, or what you guys would be talking about, in the context of some form of cyber threat. So no is the answer, and I hope, and I know I said this last time, Mike, but I hope it stays that way.
I know. Well, it's been a year, so that's obviously a good step in the right direction, right? So
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. So this last one's from me because when I'm thinking about your role and the amount of things that you touch on in terms of the regulatory compliance side, my question to you is: do you ever just kind of throw your hands up and say the regulations and the compliance side make this too hard, or do you see the whole part of this job as half of it is being compliant and half of it is using innovative technology?
That is such a good question. So if our MD, who's a serial entrepreneur, would be sitting here, he'd go like, yes, way too hard. I want to throw up hands. Okay, so look, the regulations are hectic. As you quite rightly heard, we are bound by where we can get permission to fly. A lot of times the municipalities are not responsive. It really does hinder. Now, from my perspective of a safety officer in our company, I would say that most of that makes complete sense from a safety perspective, because if that didn't exist, then the replacement for that would be the categorization model, drone ID, UTM, and everything we don't yet have. So lifting any of what we have now or reducing the cumbersome nature of what we do needs to be replaced with something. And dare I say it, I mean, in our country, we're pretty lawless. We just kind of, people just don't adhere to rules. And this is aviation, right? So I would say it's a really fine line, Mike, between the frustration of being able to operate and the speed at which we can operate. So we have a whole fleet of aircraft waiting to so we've gotten to like the last hurdle of getting them registered, and then now need to get on our op spec, and now we're just waiting. And until that happens, you can't operate. So now it's like they're just standing there, and it's expensive kit. And you're like, ah. So a lot of it's process and how quickly it can happen. I think there's a really fine line between, I think the regulations are good because it drives safety and the right behavior. And it's also something we have to do until it changes. And then, seeing how it does actually hinder the development, you know, of using our technology to do cool stuff, you know. So I hope I answered that.
Yeah, you did. You did, and I share it as a fellow, you know, I guess person who deals with both on the regulatory side as well as trying to enhance and enrich with new innovative technology. It's definitely a battle you wage, but at the same time, it can have its great benefits. So, absolutely, I think you're trailblazing a lot of this, you know, things in South Africa, and really appreciated you having you on, Kim. Appreciate the stories from the field, and yeah, thanks again. I want to just ask everyone to thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Good to see you.
My pleasure.